Now that we have been introduced to the concept of active listening, I want to take you through several steps that can ensure an active listening environment. We're going to cover each of these in turn in a minute, but just to go through them quickly. Listen without interruption. Embrace silence. Listen with your ears and your eyes. Use nonverbal cues. Eliminate noise. Practice reflective listening. Summarize, and be sincere. So, listening without interruption. It's not unusual for people to jump into the middle of a conversation. And this goes back to that statistic that shows that our brains are thinking at a rate of 450 words per minute, while we hear at a rate of 350 words per minute, to someone speaking, on average, at a rate of only 150 words per minute. So we'll often start formulating a response while the speaker is still talking. And by doing so, we have quit listening to what is being said, and instead we tend to jump in with our own thoughts. Interrupting a speaker will break his or her communication flow, and it also risks sending the message that you're not fully intent on listening to all that the speaker has to say. Staying still and quiet is both a skill and a challenge. A big part of listening without interrupting involves the willingness to embrace silence. Now, many of us find ourselves uncomfortable with silence during a conversation, and, therefore we may rush in to fill any empty spaces. And you may have noticed occasions in classes or in group meetings where the teacher or the speaker will say, "Any questions?" and then immediately move on to his or her next thought. Sometimes it takes people a bit of time to start talking, or they pause while they're thinking. So don't take these pauses as an automatic invitation to jump in with your own comments. Now, as you get to know people, you will recognize these behavior patterns. That is, they start slowly or they pause in between their thoughts, and you'll recognize this in certain individuals. I often count to 7 before stepping into what I perceive to be a stalled conversation. Now, why 7 instead of 5 or 10? There's no scientific basis for this. I've just found from experience that jumping in before 7 seconds sometimes cuts people off. But waiting 4 to 10 seconds to begin, sometimes that can feel a little bit too long. So if you're having a very difficult conversation and the speaker is visibly upset, in this case, you might want to wait a little bit longer. So, allow for a little bit of extra silent time. Now, think for a moment of a time when you may have spoken to someone and you were met with silence. How did that feel to you? What were you assuming was going on? Did you try to control the silence? And if so, how? So, the question really here, the challenge is, how can we actively listen to silence? Listening with your ears and your eyes, this is all about being attentive to the body language of the speaker. So pay attention to the speaker's posture, to his or her eye contact with you, and the tone of the voice. So is what you're hearing matching the behavior or the facial expressions that you're seeing, or is there a disconnect between those things? Using nonverbal cues to express interest. This is, ways that you can communicate to the listener to the speaker that you're actually attentively listening to them. And you can do this by sitting near him or her as opposed to having a big desk between you. So eliminate some of those gaps in space. Leaning slightly forward, maintaining good eye contact, smiling, nodding your head. All of these things will kind of send messages without you saying anything that you are paying attention. And we will be talking about body language and nonverbal cues in more detail in this lecture. Eliminating noise. This is very important. Optimally, we should all be active listeners in every conversation that we have. However, in reality, this is seldom the case. Listening fully with the ability to block out all internal noise is always a challenge for people. In a world of constant multitasking, we now find ourselves easily distracted, not only by our own thoughts, but also by other outside stimulants, such as our smartphones. Now, I can't count the number of business meetings and luncheons that I have attended in the past few years where people pulled out their phones and put them on the table in front of them. And as often as not, these individuals will also automatically, they'll continually be checking their phones throughout the meeting. This type of behavior blocks the individual from focusing completely on the meeting. It causes a distraction, and really, I think it's just plain rude to others in the meeting. Now, this behavior had become so prevalent with my own staff that shortly before I retired, I had to put a stop to people pulling out their phones at our weekly staff meetings. And since I've mentioned that, I'm going to hold off on a continued discussion of active listening just for a minute in order to refer back to last week's lecture. My telling staff that they couldn't bring their phones to our weekly full staff meetings, what is that? That's an example of downward communication, right? I'm telling them or asking them, please don't do this. So it's a downward message. Now, I knew that this was going to be a somewhat contentious announcement, and I had to think carefully about how to deliver this message in a way that people could hear it and understand it. First, some background on my decision. While not everyone looked at their phones during meetings, there were more than a few who did so, and it was obvious to others in the room. They could see them doing it. And also, as our full staff meetings were often, they included presentations by staff members, it wasn't just me who was being ignored during these meetings. So rather than call out individuals during the meeting and or making a general announcement at a full staff meeting, I decided to wait until I had my monthly one-on-one meeting with each staff member. I then used that opportunity to ask staff members to please be considerate by not pulling out their phones during meetings. And I reminded them of how frustrating it was for them to be teaching a class when students were texting or otherwise looking at their phones instead of paying attention. I kept the message low-key and friendly, and that is, it was a request. It really wasn't a demand. I actually just asked, please don't do this. And I also asked my other managers to have the same discussion with their staff. Now, as we discussed last week, messages don't always get delivered accurately when they're passed down from one level of staff to another. So I can't be sure that my message was delivered the same way to everyone, but the reaction to the message from people with whom I spoke was positive. By not making a big deal of this, by speaking to everyone individually and therefore not singling anyone out, and by pointing out that their behavior was similar to the student behavior that frustrated them, the message was heard. And I think it really helped when I didn't make this about myself, but noted that their behavior was not very respectful to their colleagues when the latter were giving presentations in our meetings. And in any event, it solved the problem. Okay, so back to active listening. Smartphones are just one example of unwelcome distractions. Others include picking up a phone call in the middle of a meeting, or stopping the meeting momentarily to speak to someone else, or shuffling through papers or doing other work while the meeting is ongoing. All of these behaviors deflect attention away from the meeting, and it hampers a person's ability to fully listen. It also sends a message, intentional or otherwise, that your time is more important than the person or people with whom you are speaking. So, in addition to controlling your internal noise, those distracting thoughts that enter your brain while you're listening, eliminate environmental noise as much as possible. And there are some steps you can do to do this. And these things include things like finding a quiet place to talk, a quiet, private place to have a meeting. Closing the office door to maintain privacy. Minimizing interruptions. Don't have people walking in and out. Muting your phone, and this should be both your office phone and your personal smartphone or cell phone. And we'll revisit some of these points next week when we discuss how to handle difficult discussions and conversations, but keep those in mind. Okay, let's talk a little bit about reflective listening. Reflective listening is a part of active listening, and it's often used when you're discussing a problem that someone has brought to you. In reflective listening, the goal is not to ask questions and gather information. Rather, it's an attempt to understand what is being said and thought by the speaker through paraphrasing and reflecting back their thoughts in your own words. And this technique demonstrates to the individual who is speaking that you're sincerely interested in and listening to what they are saying. Now, some common tenets of reflective listening include things like listen more, talk less, keep your voice level and consistent, strive to understand the feelings, not just the facts, restate and clarify what is being said, avoid judgment, don't give any advice, and react with sincere empathy and acceptance. Reflective listening, like active listening, is about showing your respect for and interest in the person who is talking to you. So let's look at an example. First of all, let's look at some examples of language that you could use while you're talking to someone. So you could say, if I understand what you're saying, I hear you saying, as I understand it. These are just some examples to let the person know that you're hearing what they're saying and you're going to reflect back their thoughts. So here's a brief example of reflective listening. So you've got Paul and Jim here, and Paul's saying, I'm really upset that Dan is leaving the library. I can't pretend that I like the guy, and we all know he has a lousy work ethic, but he's the only other IT specialist here. His leaving is going to put a lot of pressure on me. And Jim says in response, he said, so you're worried that Dan's leaving will put extra work on you. Now, in this example, Jim is reflecting Paul's thoughts back to him, and he has paraphrased Paul's concerns. When reflecting back, you may find that you misunderstood what was being said. And there's nothing wrong with misunderstanding. In fact, by reflecting back, you're attempting to ensure that you do understand what the speaker is saying, in contrast to just assuming that you understood what was being said. And sometimes you do have to correct your reflection, and that's fine. That's okay. So using the same example again, you've got Paul, and Paul says, I'm really upset that Dan is leaving the library. I can't pretend I like the guy. We all know he has a lousy work ethic, but he's the only other IT specialist here. His leaving is going to put a lot of pressure on me. And in this case, Jim says, you wish that Dan wasn't leaving the library. And Paul said, no, I didn't say that. I'm concerned that I'm going to be left doing all the IT work. And then Jim comes back and says, oh, okay, so I see. So you're concerned that you will have a lot of extra work to do. So, in this case, he has kind of corrected his assumption of what he thought he understood. All right. Then, in closing the conversation, make sure that you summarize the major points that the speaker has shared. And this will reinforce to the speaker that you've been attentively listening, and it also gives you an opportunity to make sure you understood what was said. And some of the summary language you could use includes, I would like to take a moment to summarize what I heard you say, or let's review what we discussed. To summarize, your concerns are, or you feel that. So you can use any of these to kind of summarize your conversation. Above all else, be sincere and empathetic. If you're just paying lip service to the active listening and questioning things we talked about, it's going to become obvious. And also, try to be as relaxed and natural as possible. Now, I realize this can be sometimes easier said than done, but if you're either insincere or you're very tense and nervous, it will come through in your communications.